All righty, let's begin. I'm going to share my screen. It's going to take a minute. Let's see, sharing my sound. And hopefully you can see it right now. So this is my presentation of the comparative study between China, New Zealand, and the United States and their education systems. So my name is Jacqueline McDonough. This is for EDU 607, part of our signature assignment, and we are going to begin. Alrighty, for an introduction, we have the United States shown to the right here, New Zealand right below it, and then the country of China right below that. So the issue we're looking at is the education systems and what their guidance is for different countries to determine the level of quality of education over quantity of students within the classrooms. So the problem is the disconnection of the child identity, which is part of our research when we're studying students and their educational outcomes placed in the countries of high populations and poverty-stricken areas. So children that are stuck in situations that they're not being provided enough food and enough water, maybe housing is insufficient, or they're not able to stay in a place that's safe. Maybe there's abuse going on, there's many different things that could be causing these students to be struggling in school beyond their educational content areas that they're trying to meet. So it's just putting them behind before they've even began. The dilemma is that in the education system, should economic and societal systems be the reason for the lack of the inclusion and quality over the quantity of students learning because of the population number and the funding for the schools? So we're trying to see if the countries or the education systems can strive to break free of the standards and pursue the problems and the issues as listed above that they're facing in order to provide that quality education. So the question is, how does the United States, New Zealand, and China's education system comparatively stimulate individualized and group education to increase the identity of the child in the classroom? So on this little bubble chart, we have China, New Zealand, and the United States. And over the next multiple slides, we're going to see those bubbles filled in verbally. For our thesis statement and the research question, our thesis statement says, when beginning my education and career as an educator, I found myself trying to look for many different ways and means to provide education in form of individualized learning and or group learning. But when we're looking at other countries and their best practices and strategies, it's leading us to higher education options in terms of quality over quantity. In different countries like China, New Zealand, and the United States, of course, there are very different policies for best practices and strategies for teachers in approaching education. But it kind of depends on whether the country is looking at equity or equality or individualized learning as a whole or group learning, so as a class cohesively. So as stated previously in the last slide, our research question is, how does the United States, New Zealand, and China's education systems stimulate individualized and group education to increase the identity of the child in the classroom? Let's get into it. So China, the social fabrics, let me move my camera, hopefully you're not seeing it covering part of the screen. Social fabrics and general background. In the country of China, the population is listed at 9.6, at over 0.3 billion and 9.6 square kilometers. That's a lot of people packed into the country. The economic makeup is constantly increasing at about 7 to 8% per year. So they're constantly increasing. And it's just growing both economically and socially in terms of quantity. That was from Education 2016, page 10. When we see China, we see a large population, but lack informing education systems that share strategies or the general education systems exhibiting the styles of learning for said students. So leading us to the question, what is education like in China for the students, and how does the education system implement learning for their students? So the education system, as we said, there's 260 million students in this education system, 15 million teachers, roughly 514,000 schools. That's per the National Bureau of Statistics in China in 2014. So as we know, it's increasing yearly by 10 to 12%. So looking at those numbers, it's increased immensely. With such large group of peoples, education is guided by the Ministry of Education there in China. And they're also the ones who reform not only the laws, but educational plans, budget allocations, information services, policy guidance, and finally administrative means. So they have their plates and their hands completely tied and full, but also are the ones that can make changes. The education system of China, the government, and the Ministry of Education are the two primary impacts on education and the reforms that have and continue to occur in their education system. They also have two primary sources of payment in terms of funding for their education system and in the communities of China. So next, the successes, challenges, and debate of China's approaches to education. So we're getting into some successes that they're having, some challenges that they're facing, and some controversial issues that might be occurring. So number one, from Zhang 2019, approaches an issue with the education system that has been continually challenged for China's government and ministry to reform. The focus of this product of education becoming qualitative as primary over quantitative numbers that would lead to educational output. So they're focusing on quality over quantity, or looking to reform that. China's education system is looking at how individualized education shows great respect for individual differences of students, thus sticking to principles of student-oriented learning and approaches, from page 223 in Zhang 2019. This is where we find recurring issues of individualized learning, though, being a focus of group learning as a direction because of the number of students in China. So as we know, China has a great focus and a great idea of approaching student-centered education by meeting their needs to the students to incorporate student fairness and increase the quality of education. But currently we're looking at the strategies that they are trying to implement and seeing that they are needed due to stress from the families and the parents because of testing and because of where the students are at developmentally and such in content areas like math, science, literature. They're just constantly pushing them so hard. So the stressors are there and it's debilitating. That's some of the research that I found, but some ways that they're trying to combat these issues is through tailored student plans created by the teachers in their classrooms that know the children personally, individualized assessment. So they're looking at ways to assess each child as an individual, and not for their individual traits, but individually in a way that they're able to understand what they are being assessed on and able to output from their brains of what they're learning. And then also family-like care approaches. Now let's look at New Zealand. So the social fabrics and general background. New Zealand is a constitutional monarchy with Queen Elizabeth II and the head of state. They're also represented by the Governor General, and the Prime Minister is making decisions for the country in combination of guidance with the government itself. So when it comes to the economy reform, the government has leaned towards small business enterprises over large corporations. So it's lacking and is negative. There's negative aspects towards funding and research development, but it's also positive because of the options they're able to have to research and develop new skills and learning. To develop new learning approaches and styles for teaching. An interesting fact that I found about the country's growth in New Zealand is that they're expected their population to be growing over 12%, around 12% over the next 20 years, while being led by a number of tertiary educational institutions. New Zealand is compiled of both private and public institutions that are either comprehensive or specialized in skills. So the necessary for advancements of primary through post-secondary school. This leads us to understanding of the educational system of New Zealand and the connections to their successes, challenges, and controversial approaches to learning. So the educational system of New Zealand. While the education system of New Zealand is not new, the policy reform is constant and makes the present change in forbearing policies laid in place by past generations. The policies reformed are amended by many different agencies. So their agencies are the MOE, which is the Ministry of Education, the TEC, Territory, I don't think I'm saying that right, Education Commission, the NZQA, which is the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, and Career Services Rapura, TEC, NZQA, and Career Services Rapura, including the Ministry of Education. So it's those main agencies that are forming, reforming, and implementing them through governmental funding. So one major impact of the policy reform is that the above groups listed do meet regularly, which is very surprising that they're meeting regularly with that many and that such a vast, diverse group of people focused on the education for the students. And they're constantly trying to place in the culture, tradition, to be able to implement the culture and tradition of the students that drives the education system for their individuality. So some successes, challenges, and debates of New Zealand's education. They're successful in identifying the issue pertaining to equity and guidance for students in the classrooms when concerned with their own cultural and demographic backgrounds. We're also seeing challenge in the rise of inclusions of students with special needs. They are trying to mainstream them through education. There's lack of training, lack of educational resource, as we said recently, because of the small business approach to their economy. And there is a lack of support and understanding legal rights of children, including legislation that implements strategies so that schools can effectively cater to the whole child and support diversity. So this led New Zealand into creating the ICO or AKO, per the article Leading Transformative Education Reform in New Zealand Schools. The AKO or ICO is described to be a teaching or learning relationship shared between the teacher and the student, where they learn from each other, grounded in commitment to equity, excellence, and belonging for all. If that's not creating the identity of the child, I don't know what is. The other thing that I know personally about New Zealand is the implementation of the learning story. Creates the child's identity immediately. We could go, if you want to meet with me and we can go over the learning stories, let's do it. I will present you the full presentation that I do for the learning stories conferences that I do. And finally, the United States and the social fabrics in the background. As for the United States, it is a nation of immigrants with a short history where old-fashioned ideas are seldom preserved and new ideas are accepted easily and developed unrestrictedly under the influence of multicultural values. So when I found this quote, it made it easy to reflect upon the essence of our United States and the social fabrics while expelling the influences of multicultural values that we're having and the traditions / cultures that the United States is holding in their education system throughout the years and over so many years. The article really triangulates around the meaning and purpose of family in education, and the importance of family in American culture is very high. So the push of culture, traditions, and acceptance is a very, very hot topic in the United States as per social fabric throughout the history of the United States, including the incorporation of said topics into the educational system because of the culmination of importance of it to the United States historically and currently now. So the education system normally begins in primary school, so preschool, kind of iffy, but the main grade that they start in is the kinder through middle school, and then middle school through high school, and then some hopefully education after that, right? So the focus is the overall development of the child and the whole child, but I totally lost my train of thought. They also have trade schools, private colleges, community college career programs, or even universities that are available for students to go on to after they finish grade 12. With the majority of public schools running off of state funding, there is some funding provided by federal level. So some successes, challenges, and debate of the United States approaches to education. There's great success always in the United States, and I feel that this is something that we are all accepting, but because of our diverse areas and our goal for equality among all students, we're kind of losing that sense of inclusion and quality. Yes, we are including students, and yes, there is equality to education, but due to the number of students, quantity is becoming an issue and a focus over quality. So in the article, Meeting the Challenges of Curriculum and Instruction in the School Settings of the United States, the author states that the classrooms are diverse, but they present a hole in education for students from diverse cultural give me 1 minute. I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold. The major challenges is brought on by the success of diversity-driven and densely populated countries. The interpretation of all of this. What are the historical, political, social, and economic issues as they affect education in your topic? Some of the issues that affect the topic is the research was strictly founded to be population, of course, and the rise of it. Lack of teaching, training, and professional development, the resources available for both teachers and students, the lack of reform, both from the economic and political level, and finally, the need for change and the reform towards equity and equality. So focusing on where they want to go next. Is it equity? Is it equality? Is it equity of opportunity like the United States is? But we'll get into that later. How does the issues or problems or dilemmas impact the two countries in the US? So these problems and issues affect the topic of individualization in terms of equality over equity, because when there are too many children, or there's a high number of children and a low number of teachers in these classrooms, we're presented with achievement gaps. We're presented with lack of resources for both the students and the teachers because of the high numbers. There's needs for reform and rethinking in terms of approaching education in this current situation that has been current and historically occurring. So the juxtaposition, the criteria for this comparative analysis is the background and advancements formed to the differing needs of individual students. From China to New Zealand and then to the United States, a constant battle towards individualizations of students is becoming a best practice or an unrealistic expectation when it comes to population, diversity, demographics, cultures, and the education system itself. So each country brings about strategies to face these issues of individualization or equity of opportunity over group learning. So China is dealing with the situation through a focus on creating education suitable for students. So it's less stressful, as I said recently, and they're using individualization tactics and strategies. So their practice of student-oriented learning and respect for individual differences between students is a strategy they're using, affecting those social factors and trying to change them. So through China, they're implementing tailored student plans, designing individualized assessments based off student success. Challenges also, because if we're not just looking at this, if we're looking at just success, then we are increasing just success in my mind. So if we're not looking at those challenges and realizing where they're struggling and where there's that needed improvement, then there's not going to be focus on it. So we're changing those learning styles. And finally, family-like care and former relationships and connections to those peers and the teachers in their classrooms. New Zealand is dealing with the issue through equitable education, including the personal rights as a citizen for the children in the country of New Zealand. So they're creating that sense of belonging, they're creating the identity of the child, and their education is connecting through relationships and peers with their peers and their teachers. So that ICO, the reformation that has recently happened in New Zealand, to focus on that teacher-child relationship and what they can learn from each other. The United States is dealing with it, with the issue of having high numbers in the population. So they are on a difficult playing field because of that. And the less teachers is a contrast to the number of students that is occurring. We're increasing the professional development, education, and training for those teachers. And then teachers are being turned around. Instead of equality, they're being focused on equity of opportunity. So this equity of opportunity focuses on boosting access to high quality early learning, supporting local innovations to create stronger, more diverse schools. The government is forming grants that focus on preschool development, and also Pell Grants for those of low income and disabled or higher education, so past high school. And then acts that they've created that are pushing this equity of opportunity are the acts of the Promise Neighborhoods, continuing that Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA Act, and investing in innovation for these educational opportunities. China itself and New Zealand and what they can learn from each other. So China itself is learning much about education and connection to the population, to equity and equality. While we're looking at China, they are following a few principles as presented by New Zealand. So they're looking at how to support the child as an individual. They're looking at the importance of creating the identity of the young child. They're incorporating creating education suitable for students, and through this education that is individualized. New Zealand and China are learning from each other about showing great respect for individual differences of students, which therefore is student-oriented learning. From Zhang 2019 to page 23. What can the U.S. learn from China and New Zealand? On that note, the United States is looking towards the future of equity of education. So with the IDEA Act, the Promise Neighborhoods Act, and the Every Student Succeed Act, they're looking at opportunities for improvement of equity of opportunity for students in the classroom. So from New Zealand, they're learning on how to create practices that are student-oriented learning focused and respecting individual differences between students. So they're using those student plans from China and New Zealand. They're using the designing individualized assessment based off their needs and their challenges and their successes, and their learning styles, of course. And then they're incorporating those family-like care and formal relationships. I think that would be a great thing to incorporate. So the other thing that I think that the United States should be incorporating and can learn from New Zealand and China is that AKO, the ICO, which is from New Zealand, of course. Great practice. Learning from the students, teachers learning from the students learning from the teachers, creating and building that relationship kind of all pulls it all together. I really like this style. They just said the United States just needs to commit with the education system and teachers to commit to continuing their careers themselves in education and focus on creating policies that will uphold that child's identity. Conclusion. Here we go. What are the goals and potential solutions to this problem of individual or group learning? So I put out 3 main strategies, one from each country that we can pull that will hopefully and effectively solve our issues and our problems, or at least begin to. one strategy, two strategies, three strategies are not going to solve our problems, but through those strategies, we will be able to research and find more strategies and more best practices that will be implemented to create that identity of the child in the classroom through equitable education. So strategy number one, focus on the individual. This provides for both economic and social system growth due to the more skilled and higher educated workers in their workforce. So this reformation is from China. Strategy number two, the relationship built between teachers and students, where teachers learn from students and students learn from teachers. Following through with that ACO reformation and policy created by New Zealand. And strategy number three, focusing on that equity of opportunity as per the United States in their new reform they are currently working on to create equal education based on each individual student's needs and their demographic backgrounds, including their culture and their traditions and their strengths and their weaknesses and their needs and where they've came from and what they're doing next. So we're looking at that reform of equity of opportunity, making sure that students are getting what they need to learn what they need and where they're going in the future, what they're learning. And finally, these are our resources, and thank you very much for listening. I am so sorry for coughing in half of my presentation, but we did it. Thank you so much. This is Jacqueline signing off.